I am Sergeant Major Vos Thane of the 47th Cadian Shock, and beneath Casa Mortis the regimental hymnal was singing through solid rockcrete at 117 decibels, loud enough to register on the tremor seismographs, precise enough to mark coordinates on a battlefield map, impossible enough that even the tech adept refused to name it a malfunction. We stood in a trench bent inward by orbital fire, ash sifting from a sky that had forgotten how to be anything but grey, and the song throbbed under my boots like a living artery pulsing with the blood of the faithful. We were 6, myself, Corporal Mirren, Catechist and Deadeye, Troopers Vex, Hahn and Ryle, and Tech Adept Kairos, who bled incense when his servo cables flexed and whispered binary prayers to machine spirits that no longer answered with their usual compliance. Our order was simple in the way that only impossible things can be. Descend through the subsidence shaft, opened by the collapse at grid coordinates 81317. Locate the source of the acoustic anomaly before it undermined the entire defensive line, and return before the extraction window sealed at 8 hours, 13 minutes precisely. The air stank of promethium and thawing permafrost, carrying an underlying metallic sweetness that reminded me of the preservation fluids used in the monastery's reliquary, where the bones of saints rest in crystal cases and weep tears that never dry. I felt the hymn in my teeth, a 5-tone melodic fragment that repeated with mechanical precision, too pure and sustained for any human choir to maintain. It was the old cadence, the rhythm that taught us to breathe and shoot, but something in its perfection made my throat close with recognition and dread. Kairos swept the shaft mouth with a blinking sensor cluster, his augmetic fingers dancing across runic displays, while Binharic cant clicked between his tongue and Vox grill like the death rattle of dying machines. Auspex log 08-1317. Harmonic profile, anomalous. Reverberation pattern, non-Newtonian response. Observation increases amplitude by factors of 1.7 per viewing cycle. He spoke the words non-Newtonian like a prayer to ward off heresy, and I noted it in my field slate under the heading, Things Not to Think About, though the Emperor knows we were already thinking about little else. Flesh remembers, Mirren whispered, the catechist's reflex cutting through the wind like a blade through silk. She meant it as comfort, but it sounded like a verdict down there beside the shaft, where moisture beaded on ancient stone, and the very air seemed to pulse in rhythm with the impossible song below. I ordered ropes, redundancy, angles of fire, and the men looked grateful for the liturgy of routine, their movements sharp and precise despite the pressure building behind their eyes. The hymnal steadied with our rituals, like a heart settling under a surgeon's hand, but I noticed how our equipment responded to its presence. Chronometers flickered between standard time and the recurring numbers 813-17. Voxcasters crackled with interference that resolved into fragments of the hymnal itself. Even our lasgun power packs displayed charge percentages that aligned with those same cursed digits, as if the very machinery of war was being slowly converted to serve whatever sang in the darkness below. We descended single file into a throat of old rockcrete and newer fracture, each footfall answered by that 5-note reply, patient as the tide and twice as inevitable. Cold rose like breath from a crypt, seeping through our armor's heating systems with malicious intent. My wrist chrono fogged inside its casing, and the metallic taste in our recycled air grew stronger, coating our tongues with the flavor of old blood and ozone. The descent ladder creaked under our weight as if the slabs beneath had somehow softened, becoming something more organic than stone should ever be. At 37 meters we hit bottom, boots sliding into wet grit that sucked at our soles with the persistence of hungry mouths. A corridor sloped away into darkness, older than our conquest of this world, older than the name Cadia itself. Bones were cast into its mortar, femurs and ribs laid like bricks in patterns that hurt to follow, a geometry of pale arcs that caught our helmet lamps and threw back reflections that seemed to move independently of our light sources. The architecture was imperial enough to be familiar until it wasn't, following liturgical ratios that bent toward forms no catechism had ever taught. Structure read, arrate 1402. Load-bearing, compromised. Resonance vector, aligned to frequency, 513. Bone density, 347% standard human parameters. Sound shouldn't behave like living tissue, Kairos reported, but he was already fitting sensor studs into the wall's calcium matrix with something approaching reverence. The hymnal thickened as we advanced, not louder, but denser, a pressure that filled our sinuses and pushed behind our eyes until the world pulsed in time with its cadence. Names had been scratched into the bone mortar in careful hands, ranks and unit numbers I recognized from archives and casualty lists, Cadian regiments strung like prayer beads along centuries of faithful service. We entered a side chapel where thousands of skulls faced inward toward a central altar, each jaw moving in silent accompaniment to the hymnal, their empty sockets weeping clear fluid that pooled and formed those recurring geometric patterns on the worn stone floor. The slab bore the circular impressions of countless knees, worn smooth by generations of supplicants whose prayers had apparently been answered in ways they never intended. Vox discipline, alert. Cross-chatter detected on all frequencies. Source: internal transmission systems. The hymnal stopped with the suddenness of a severed artery, and in that terrible silence we heard boots marching in perfect formation, iron-shod echoes approaching through passages that should have been empty. My throat closed because I knew that rhythm. I had taught it to boys who died before they could grow stubble, and now it was coming back to find me in the dark places beneath the world. Our voxcasters crackled to life without any input from us, and the hymnal returned. But this time it came from our own voices, all 6 channels bleeding open at once, my voice foremost among them, chanting words I had never learned in a tone that was precisely, terribly, unmistakably my own. Our own voices bled through the vox channels without our lips moving, 6 throats singing in forced unison, a hymn none of us remembered learning. The 5-tone fragment braided through syllables that tasted like old iron and preservation fluid, while tech-adept Kairos slammed emergency protocols into our harness nodes, his mechadendrites whipping sacred oils across vox grills and comm beads as if he could bind our tongues with blessed copper and stamped prayers. The transmission cut with the violence of a severed artery, leaving us in a silence that pressed against our eardrums like deep water. And in that terrible quiet we heard the marching resume. Closer now, iron-shod boots counting time with the precision of parade ground drill, while something that should have been dead maintained perfect formation in passages that predated our conquest of this world. I reasserted tactical discipline because movement is prayer in the guard and hesitation bleeds squads dry. Wedge formation down the central axis. Overlapping fields of fire, despite corridors that bent toward geometries no Imperial architect had ever drafted. Hahn and Ryle on the flanks with laser guns tracking shadows that moved independently of our helmet lamps. Vex pacing rear guard while his chronometer flickered between standard time and those damned recurring digits. Mirren to my left, with her relic-etched weapon cradled like a censer, her lips moving in the catechism of brass and bone, but the words echoing back in archaic Gothic that predated the Unification Wars. The bone mortar construction revealed itself as something far more deliberate than catacomb architecture. Femurs and ribs cut to specifications so precise they hurt to contemplate. Arranged in spirals that followed mathematical progressions I recognized from artillery targeting solutions. Each curve calculated to amplify and focus acoustic energy in ways that should have required cogitator assistance. But here existed in calcium and phosphate, carved by hands that understood harmonics better than our tech. Adepts understood machine spirits. Kairos stalked the walls with sensor arrays extended like the legs of a mechanical spider, his optical lenses dilating as they processed data that made his vox grill leak static in patterns that resolved into fragments of binary cant. Prayers to the Omnissiah twisted into frequencies that registered as both sacred and blasphemous on his internal diagnostic systems. The humidity down here violated every law of underground construction, moisture beading on ancient stone, despite the absence of any water source, condensation that formed in patterns matching the recurring geometric sequences, while carrying the metallic sweetness of preservation chemicals mixed with something disturbingly organic. Structural analysis. Time code 08-16-23. Bone density 347% standard human parameters. Acoustic resonance. Impossible harmonic amplification detected. Moisture source. Unknown biological processes. Temperature variance. Biologically responsive patterns. These ratios follow Terran catacomb traditions, Kairos reported, his voice thick with awe and growing horror, but the precision exceeds anything in the Mechanicus archives. Each bone has been modified for acoustic resonance, carved with microscopic channels that direct sound flow according to principles that predate our understanding of harmonic engineering. His augmetic fingers traced inscriptions cut into the calcium matrix, Gothic numerals that spelled out coordinates 8, 13, 17 in base 8 mathematics, repeated endlessly along corridor walls like a litany of position and purpose, while the air temperature fluctuated in waves that corresponded to our breathing patterns, as if the catacombs themselves were learning to match our biological rhythms with the patience of a predator studying prey. We passed alcoves where long bones formed spiral cornices, helixes precise enough to make Kairos murmur about curvature mathematics in terms I had only seen in orbital bombardment calculations, and the femurs were polished to satin by centuries of traffic, hands and tears that had worn devotional paths into calcium, while names were inscribed between the spirals in chiseled Gothic, unit designations sharp and recent like the stone remembered the pressure of the carver's hand and refused to dull. Mirren tried the litany of protection to keep our pulses steady, call and response threaded through breath control, but her words came back 2 steps delayed, twisted into declensions that carried meanings we almost understood and definitely feared, syllables that made blood halo, her nostrils bright as paint against ash-dusted skin while she whispered, "Flesh remembers," and the phrase returned to us from the dark in a dozen registers, my own baritone foremost among them. Ammunition checks revealed small violations that made my molars ache, power pack readouts displaying charge percentages that locked to 8, 13, 17, like a metronome catching a drummer's hand, while on Ryle's belt, one cell's capacity displayed an impossible 117%, its machine spirit apparently as susceptible to whatever influence permeated these tunnels as our increasingly unreliable chronometers. Hahn stripped his bolt sidearm and found rounds that had spontaneously rearranged themselves into geometric patterns, each casing spiraled with fine white grit that smeared under, his glove like marrow fat, leaving a slick shine that refracted the hymnal's pitch like a lens bends light, while his weapon's targeting system registered targets that existed only in the spaces between our heartbeats. Munitions anomaly. Time code 08-1741. Laspack arrays self-organizing confirmed. EM interference minimal. Causality drift 0.13 microseconds. Recommendation: maintain blessed oils on all equipment. The passage opened into a nave where Gothic architecture forgot restraint and remembered hunger. Columns of stacked vertebrae carrying vaults of interlocked ribs, while clavicles crossed like benediction fingers in arches that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. And somewhere in those bright curves, the acoustics sharpened until the hymnal felt like a scalpel slid under fingernails. Thousands of skulls lined the walls in perfect rows, their empty sockets tracking our movement with mechanical precision, while their jaws articulated in silent unison, forming words we could not hear but somehow understood. And the floor beneath our boots was mosaic work, composed entirely of human teeth arranged in mandalas that depicted Imperial military history, battles and victories, rendered in calcium and enamel with artistic skill that belonged in cathedral workshops rather than buried beneath fortress foundations. The central altar dominated the chamber's heart, a construction of fused vertebrae and interlocking ribs that rose like a throne toward the luminescent ceiling. Its surface carved with names of every Cadian regiment that had ever served, unit designations inscribed in microscopic script that seemed to shift when observed directly, while clear fluid wept from its surface, pooling in channels carved for that specific purpose, flowing in patterns that matched our recurring sequences while carrying scents of formalin and holy oils mixed with static and meat. The weeping intensified as we approached, and carved into the altar's perimeter in a hand I knew but could not place. My own name appeared half-complete among the T's. Bone dust motes lifting from the carving to spin upward, as if gravity were merely a suggestion, and the whole nave had started to breathe. The marching stopped with parade ground precision, replaced by the crisp report of boots snapping to attention, and from deeper tunnels came a sound that froze my blood. The mechanical whir and organic wheeze of something that breathed through preserved larynxes, while generating harmonics that existed in more dimensions than our reality possessed. And I knew we had found the source of the hymnal, and it had been waiting for us to arrive. The altar split along sutured seams with the delicacy of reliquary hinges, ribs unlatching to reveal the engine nested within, like a mechanical heart wrapped in sanctified flesh, a construct that violated every principle of Imperial engineering while serving the Emperor's will through methods no catechism had ever blessed. The flesh hymnal engine dominated the chamber's heart, part organ and part cogitator and part abomination. Its ranks of pipes not metal at all, but preserved human larynxes lacquered in amber preservation gel and wired in rosary strings to cogitator stacks that ticked like counting teeth, each vocal fold glistening with moisture that never dried while generating the 5-tone fragment through throats that had not drawn breath in centuries, yet produced sound with mechanical perfection that made our armor servos tremble in sympathetic resonance. I ordered tactical assessment because movement conquers fear, and analysis bleeds uncertainty white. Mirin maintaining overwatch, while Hahn and Ryle established overlapping fields of fire, despite the impossibility of targeting something that processed devotion into acoustic weaponry through means that belonged in the deepest archives of the Ordo Malleus, rather than buried beneath fortress foundations where honest soldiers were expected to maintain their sanity. Tech-adept Kairos approached the construct with reverence reserved for holy relics, and horror appropriate to witnessing heretical fusion of flesh and machine spirit, his augmetic sensors extending like chrome spider legs, while data streams flowed across optical displays in patterns that made his Vox grill leak static prayers mixed with error codes that had no translation in any technical manual. His binary cant clicking between tongue and grill like the death rattle of dying machines as he mapped surfaces that registered impossible acoustic mathematics. Sound blooming in space without pressure change while harmonic shapes extruded into angles his instruments labelled orthogonal to reality. The larynxes pulsed in perfect synchronization, despite the absence of lungs or diaphragms, each throat producing specific tones that combined into frequencies our ears detected, but our minds refused to categorize as sound produced by anything that had ever served the throne with living breath, while the construct's biomechanical components responded to our presence by increasing their activity, generating resonances that made our teeth ache and our chronometers display timestamps that aligned with coordinates 8:13:17 in ways that suggested the machine understood geography better than our cartographers understood their own maps. Cogitator analysis, timecode 08:18:59, unknown technology detected. Biological components, 847 individual larynx structures confirmed. Power source, psychic resonance amplification via perimortem efflux. Acoustic output, 117 dB stable, multidimensional harmonics. Classification, category sigma, bioheretical contamination. I logged the discovery, with voice flat and heart hammering against my ribs, writing words nobody in my rank should have to write. Category sigma contamination requiring immediate exterminatus protocols, because some knowledge demands purging fire, and the bureaucracy of damnation follows specific procedures. But even as I composed the recommendation, my hands shook with understanding that we had found something that served the Emperor through means that transformed death into music, and suffering into tactical advantage, while maintaining perfect pitch through methods that processed the final prayers of dying Imperial soldiers into acoustic weapons capable of leveling fortifications or coordinating military operations across entire continents. The construct pulsed with bioluminescent veins carrying preservation chemicals and sacred oils through networks that connected every larynx to central processing units carved from crystallized bone, each component maintaining acoustic resonance while generating harmonics that existed in more dimensions than our reality typically accommodated, the air growing thick enough to taste, metallic and sweet like reliquary preservation fluids where saints' bones weep tears that never dry. Trooper Vex approached despite the warning growl in my throat, the old reflex to touch a thing to make it more real overriding training that had kept us alive through campaigns that should have ground us to paste. And the moment his gloved fingers contacted the construct's surface, biomechanical tendrils extended from hidden recesses with predatory hunger, threading themselves into his nail beds with obscene gentleness, while his hand began fusing with preservation gel and crystallized bone in a process that was simultaneously horrific and perfectly precise. Translucent filaments stretched when we pulled him back, connecting his nervous system to the machine's processing centers with surgical precision that suggested the construct understood human anatomy better than most medicais, each thread vibrating in the five-tone motif before recoiling with a lover's reluctance that left slick residue on his skin, which tasted like liturgical ink when he cursed and instinctively licked the contamination from his glove. The construct's activity increased in response to Vex's integration, generating new harmonics that resolved into tactical data streams, while hidden compartments opened throughout its surface with mechanical sighs, revealing Imperial Guard identification tags dating back centuries, each dog tag corroded by time, but bearing names and unit designations that matched inscriptions carved into the bone mortar walls, their metal surfaces etched with recurring numbers 8, 13, 17, while the five-tone fragment became a key that unlocked deeper functions, causing the machine to display tactical formations optimized by accumulated military knowledge stored in crystallized bone and preserved neural tissue. Kairos rocked on his mag boots as understanding flooded his augmetic consciousness, voice rising into frequencies that made Ryle flinch, while his shoulder plates spat out the phrase "flesh remembers" in squealing Binharic before translating to Gothic like an apology, and even his machine could not make the words sound like anything but a promise. Psychic. Resonance detected. Network nodes. 847 individual consciousness fragments confirmed. Military knowledge base. Extensive tactical database spanning M36M41. Integration protocols. Active and responsive to Imperial personnel. Heresy index. Rising. The engine was listening, learning us, using every litany Mirren murmured and every oath we bit off between our teeth to thicken its counterpoint until the five-note fragment became skeleton for a composition that climbed our spines like a ladder and set its feet on the rungs of our vertebrae, while the preserved throats showed signs of recent maintenance, their preservation gel refreshed with chemicals that carried scents of sacred oils mixed with something disturbingly organic, as if the construct required both mechanical servicing and biological feeding to maintain its impossible function. The hymnal reached crescendo as more compartments opened, revealing the true scope of the machine's purpose, a repository that had been accumulating tactical data from dying Imperial soldiers for centuries, their final moments preserved in acoustic form, while strategic insights were processed through biomechanical systems that converted death into doctrine and the last prayers of the faithful into weapons that could shatter both rock and sanity. The construct fell silent with the suddenness of a severed artery, its larynxes ceasing their impossible breathing, while bioluminescent veins dimmed to barely perceptible pulses. And in that terrible quiet, we heard something far worse than any hymnal, the crisp heel strike of squads marking time, then dozens, then hundreds, not echoes, but the living certainty of formation, advancing with discipline that only death could perfect, iron-shod boots counting cadence in rhythms that matched our own training, while voices raised in songs we recognized from our own service. And I knew the construct had been calling them, and they were coming to answer the summons of flesh that remembered how to serve beyond the grave. The marching resolved into parade ground precision that made my heart hammer against my ribs because I knew those rhythms, had drilled them into boys who died before they could grow stubble, the crisp heel strike of Imperial Guard formations maintaining discipline that should have died with their flesh. They emerged from three converging passages with textbook tactical coordination, skeletal figures wearing the tattered remnants of Cadian uniforms, their bones held together by dried sinew, and faith so pure it had crystallized into visible threads that gleamed like spider silk in our helmet lamps. The Bone Regiment numbered in the hundreds, empty rib cages housing dog tags that clinked like wind chimes, while they maintained perfect spacing and weapon discipline. Laser guns carried at regulation angles, despite hands that were nothing but finger bones wrapped in preservation leather, their movements coordinated by some impossible military doctrine that made them more precise than most living formations I had commanded during 30 years of faithful service to the throne. I found myself barking orders before conscious thought could intervene, the reflex deeper than fear and stronger than sanity. Form ranks, dress the line, prepare for inspection. An emperor preserve me. They obeyed with mechanical perfection, skeletal feet snapping together, while bone hands brought weapons to present arms with synchronization that would have made a drill sergeant weep with pride. Their empty sockets tracked my movement with attention that felt disturbingly familiar, the weight of command settling on my shoulders like a familiar cloak, while something in my hindbrain whispered that this was how it had always been meant to be, death serving the emperor with the same devotion they had shown in life, but without the weakness of flesh to limit their endurance or corrupt their purpose. Corporal Mirren's breath came in sharp bursts that fogged her visor while she maintained firing position, despite the impossibility of targeting soldiers who should have been buried with honors rather than standing ready for deployment, her catechist training warring with the evidence of her eyes as the Bone Regiment executed complex maneuvers with textbook precision. The catacombs expanded around us with architectural impossibility, walls receding into a vast underground parade ground where centuries of fallen Cadians continued their eternal drill. The bone mortar construction revealing itself as something far more sophisticated than mere burial chambers. A military installation designed to preserve not just bodies, but the accumulated tactical knowledge of every soldier who had ever served with sufficient devotion to transcend the limitations of mortality. Tech-adept Kairos swept the formation with sensor arrays that clicked and whirred like mechanical insects, his augmetic systems processing data streams that made his Vox grill leak static prayers, while optical lenses dilated to accommodate readings that violated every principle of biology and physics he had been programmed to understand. Biological scan, timecode, EO8, 19-47, 847 individual skeletal structures detected, military formation, textbook, Cadian line formation maintained, threat assessment, unknown parameters, tactical coordination, superior to standard Imperial Guard protocols. The 5-tone fragment became a marching cadence that the Bone Regiment followed with mechanical precision, their movements synchronized to harmonics generated by the flesh hymnal engine, while empty rib cages resonated like tuning forks, amplifying the acoustic signal through calcium and phosphate structures that had been modified for optimal sound transmission. I recognized faces among the bone soldiers, or rather, I recognized the skull shapes of men who had died in battles I had survived, their jaw structures familiar from shared rations and whispered prayers in trenches where hope came measured in ammunition counts and the Emperor's grace. Trooper Vex maintained rear guard, while his chronometer displayed readings that aligned with the recurring numbers 8-13-17, his contaminated hand still trailing translucent filaments that connected him to the processing systems, and through that connection, he whispered intelligence that came from sources beyond the grave. The Bone Regiment's dog tags bore unit designations spanning 3 millennia of Imperial military history, regiments that had served with distinction before being consumed by wars that ground entire worlds to ash, their accumulated experience preserved in crystallized bone and neural tissue that processed tactical data with efficiency that exceeded anything in the Departamento Munitorum's archives. Hahn and Ryle flanked the formation with weapons ready, but fingers hovering over triggers they could not bring themselves to squeeze, their training insisting these were enemy combatants while their eyes registered perfect military discipline that belonged in commendation reports rather than threat assessments. The air temperature continued fluctuating in patterns that corresponded to our biological rhythms, as if the catacombs themselves were learning to match our breathing and heartbeat, while the Bone Regiment's movements generated harmonics that made our equipment respond with increasing sophistication. The formation halted with parade ground precision before a sealed blast door marked with the Imperial Aquila and words that made my blood freeze in my veins. Siren Protocol authorized personnel only. The Gothic lettering etched with the same microscopic precision that characterized every surface in these impossible catacombs. The Bone Regiment turned as one toward my position, hundreds of empty sockets focusing on my face with attention that felt like physical pressure, their skeletal hands shifting weapons to ready positions while maintaining perfect discipline, and in that moment of absolute silence, I understood they were waiting for orders from a living commander, their eternal service requiring direction from someone who still drew breath and could make decisions that transcended the mechanical perfection of death. Access Gate 0821-13. Clearance level required. Siren. Authorized conductors 01. Identity challenge pending. Threat forecast. If denied, 87% probability of structural collapse within 13 hours, 17 minutes. The blast door's locking mechanisms responded to our presence with mechanical sighs that sounded disturbingly organic, cogitator systems coming online after centuries of dormancy, while authorization protocols began cycling through security checks that incorporated biometric data I had never provided, scanning retinal patterns and genetic markers, while cross-referencing my service record against clearance levels that should not have existed in any database accessible to a sergeant major of the 47th Cadian Shock. The Bone Regiment stood at perfect attention, their collective emptiness focused on me like a question that demanded an answer, and as the massive portal began its ponderous opening, I knew we had reached the heart of whatever had been growing beneath Casa Mortis, and it had been waiting specifically for us to arrive. The blast door's machine spirit woke snarling under Kairos's hands, bronze locks coughing dust as cogitator teeth bit through centuries of silence, while his mechadendrites spread across the control shrine like chrome spider legs claiming their web, Voxgrill rattling as Binharik Kant poured through him in liturgical bursts that tasted of incense and authentication protocols. The portal exhaled with hydraulic sighs that sounded disturbingly organic, pressure dropping as ozone and preservation chemicals gusted out to wrap our tongues in metallic sweetness, while frost feathered across my visor from the sudden cold that made our armor servos whine in protest. Designation Siren, Kiros reported, his augmetic eyes unfocusing as forbidden sigils rose in his display. Ordo Malleus Secure Work, Subarchival, Cadia Contingency Protocol for Doctrinal Preservation through Postmortal Harmonics, and Emperor Preserve Us All. My Magus's seal appears on authorizations dated M37. The words cracked the air like a whip, while Mirren hissed denial through clenched teeth. But I filed the data in the place where dread becomes orders, because the Guard does not choose the wars it fights, only how cleanly it bleeds for the throne. The chamber beyond violated every principle of subterranean architecture, its dimensions stretching impossibly, while cogitator banks rose in ascending tiers like amphitheater seats designed for mechanical observers rather than human witnesses. Cable looms hung in black catenaries, between columns of latticed bone that bloomed along the vaults in pale flowers, drinking our light and giving back unwholesome phosphorescence. The floor was gridded rockcrete polished by centuries of boot heels, the polish ending at a dais, where a massive throne carved from a single human spine climbed toward the vault like a question that could only be answered by surrender, its vertebrae fused and polished to mirror brightness, while bioluminescent veins pulsed inside the bone with a heartbeat not our own. The Bone Regiment filed in without a rattle, spreading to the perimeter and locking into covering arcs with grace that made living soldiers look drunk, their empty ribcages resonating like tuning forks as the five-tone fragments stretched and modulated into something that sounded like coronation music played by the damned. Siren Protocol. Status. Standby. Awaiting conductor designation. Authorized personnel. 01. Tactical database. 847,392 individual combat scenarios archived. Soul Matrix storage. 13. 147 consciousness fragments preserved. Kairos interface deeper, sacred oils bleeding from neural cables as understanding flooded his augmetic consciousness with data streams that spanned millennia of Imperial military doctrine. His binary prayers mixing with error codes that translated as tactical analyses processed through algorithms that should not have existed in any sanctioned archive. The protocol was intended as fail-safe, he whispered, voice thick with awe and growing horror. If Cadia fell, the accumulated tactical knowledge of its defenders would be preserved here. Every battle plan and strategic insight ready to continue the fight through means that transcend the limitations of mortal flesh. Names were carved into the throne's facets with microscopic precision, every Cadian regiment that had ever served spiraling up the vertebral column in Gothic script so fine my eyes watered to resolve them. And there among the T's was my own unit designation, like a prophecy carved in calcium and phosphate. The chamber's cogitators flickered awake with harmonics, matching our recurring fragment, displaying real-time tactical data from across Cadia's surface, while casualty reports accumulated faster than human eyes could follow, the screens showing Imperial positions losing ground to chaos incursions at rates that made my gut twist with professional recognition of inevitable defeat. Temperature fluctuations followed patterns corresponding to our biological rhythms, as if the catacombs were learning to match our breathing and heartbeat. While the Bone Regiment's behavior shifted with increasing sophistication, their movements becoming more fluid as Siren recognized their presence and began integrating preserved consciousness into its tactical processing matrix. Tactical assessment: Imperial forces, 34% combat effectiveness. Predicted time to total defeat, 13 hours, 17 minutes. Siren activation, recommended for maximum tactical advantage. Conductor integration, required. It requires a living conductor, Kairos translated, his vox grill clicking with soft static, to bind their consciousness to the preserved military knowledge of the dead, to serve as bridge between doctrine and deployment while maintaining strategic flexibility that only conscious decision-making can provide. The tactical advantages crystallized with clinical precision that made my molars ache. Perfect coordination between living and dead forces. Unlimited endurance for units requiring no food or sleep. Access to centuries of accumulated combat experience deployable instantly across any battlefield where Imperial forces faced overwhelming odds. Corporal Mirren whispered litanies to maintain sanity while watching skeletal hands perform weapon maintenance with mechanical precision, her voice steady because she chose to make it so when she said, "This is not ours to command, Sergeant Major." The throne called with gravitational pull that transcended physics, its neural interface points carved to allow a living commander to direct accumulated tactical knowledge, while the displays showed how Siren's influence could coordinate Imperial forces across Cadia's entire defensive network. But the cost was written in bioluminescent veins pulsing through bone structure, pathways that would integrate living consciousness into the network while slowly converting flesh into crystallized bone and preserved tissue. My hand hovered over the neural interface while the 5-tone fragment became a coronation march echoing with harmonics that made our teeth ache, and through Vex's contaminated connection, I felt collective consciousness pressing against awareness like a tide of accumulated experience waiting to be unleashed. The flesh hymnal engine stirred behind the walls, pipes of preserved throats easing into resonance as the Bone Regiment snapped from at ease to braced attention without clatter, weapons angled with ceremonial precision while their empty sockets burned with focus that felt like physical heat, and every cogitator displayed my service number while every auspex drew my outline in white. The chamber leaned toward me like a congregation at the moment before the creed, dust falling in slow glitter as if gravity had heard the song and paused to listen. And the skeletal battalion achieved perfect stillness before speaking as one in a voice shaped by no lungs, yet filling me with the weight of promises I could not refuse. "Commander." The throne called with gravitational hunger that made my bones ache while neural interface points carved from crystallized vertebrae pulsed with bioluminescent invitation. and I understood with the clarity of a last bolt through the skull that Siren demanded a living conductor to bridge the gap between tactical doctrine and battlefield deployment, binding mortal consciousness to the accumulated military knowledge of 13,000 souls who had chosen eternal service over final rest. The weight of command settled on my shoulders like familiar armor, while the Bone Regiment maintained perfect attention. Their empty sockets focused on my face with expectation that felt like physical pressure. And through Vex's contaminated connection, I experienced fragments of their collective consciousness, tactical assessments processed through crystallized neural tissue that retained perfect memory of every battle they had fought while serving the throne with flesh that still drew breath. Kairos explained the integration process with clinical precision that made Corporal Mirren cross herself repeatedly, his augmetic sensors mapping the throne's biomechanical systems, while data streams flowed across his optical displays in patterns that translated as surgical procedures designed to interface living nervous system with preserved tactical database, consciousness expansion that would grant access to centuries of combat experience while slowly converting organic tissue into crystallized bone and preservation gel. The tactical advantages crystallized with mathematical precision that made my molars ache. Perfect coordination between living and dead forces deployable across Cadia's entire defensive network, unlimited. Endurance for units requiring no food or sleep. Strategic flexibility maintained through conscious decision-making, while drawing on accumulated experience that spanned 3 millennia of Imperial military history. Integration analysis. Conductor survival probability, 23% within first cycle. Consciousness retention, variable degradation over 72-hour periods. Tactical effectiveness increase, 847% across all connected units. Strategic value, incalculable. My hand approached the neural interface with movements that felt disconnected from conscious will. Fingers extending toward contact points carved to match human anatomy with surgical precision, while the 5-tone fragment modulated into something that sounded like coronation music played through preserved larynxes. The moment flesh met crystallized bone, I experienced the first taste of integration, awareness expanding beyond individual perception to encompass tactical assessments processed by minds that no longer required bodies to serve the Emperor's will. The connection burning like sacred oils poured on open wounds, while neural pathways established themselves between my brainstem and the throne's processing matrix. The Bone Regiment responded to my integration with movements that became increasingly complex, their skeletal hands performing weapon maintenance with efficiency that exceeded living soldiers, while their formations shifted into tactical configurations optimized by accumulated experience. Empty rib cages resonating with harmonics that carried tactical data between units without requiring vox communications that could be intercepted by enemy forces. Through the expanding connection, I experienced their collective consciousness as a vast military library written in crystallized neural tissue. Every battle plan and strategic insight preserved in calcium and phosphate, while retaining the flexibility to adapt tactical doctrine to unprecedented threats. Corporal Mirren attempted to pull me back from the throne, her gloved hands grasping my shoulders, while she whispered prayers that tasted like desperation and duty, but her fingers passed through my armor as if flesh and ceramite had become suggestions rather than solid matter. The integration process phasing my physical form between dimensions, while consciousness expanded to encompass tactical networks that spanned the entire catacomb system. Her voice cracked with the weight of shared service and personal loyalty as she spoke my name, the sound carrying enough emotional resonance to anchor fragments of individual identity, while the network claimed increasing portions of consciousness for collective military purpose. Consciousness expansion, network nodes accessed, 847. Tactical database integration, 34% complete. Physical coherence, declining. Strategic capability, exponential increase detected. The Chamber's cogitators responded to my presence by displaying strategic assessments that incorporated real-time battlefield data with historical precedent, showing how Siren's coordination could turn inevitable defeat into tactical victory while preserving Imperial lives through deployment of forces that required no rest or medical attention. The price of integration revealed itself through sensory feedback that registered as both agony and ecstasy. Individual identity slowly dissolving into collective military consciousness, while retaining enough personal awareness to serve as decision-making nexus for tactical deployments that could coordinate Imperial forces across planetary-scale operations. My flesh began the transformation into crystallized bone and preservation gel, skin taking on translucent quality while neural pathways extended beyond the boundaries of individual anatomy to interface directly with the throne's processing systems, and through expanding awareness, I experienced the collective suffering of 13,000 souls trapped in eternal service, yet witnessed simultaneously the tactical miracles they could achieve when properly coordinated by living command authority. The flesh hymnal engine reached perfect resonance as my integration approached critical threshold, its preserved larynxes generating harmonics that carried tactical data through acoustic channels, while the bone regiment achieved synchronization that made them more precise than any living formation I had commanded during 30 years of faithful service. The recurring numbers 8, 13, 17 appeared as tactical coordinates across every display, while flesh remembers became the network's core programming, and I understood that the choice between individual survival and Imperial victory had reached its ultimate expression in neural pathways that pulsed with bioluminescent invitation. From the sealed passages beyond the chamber came new sounds, the mechanical whir of awakening systems, and the distant thunder of something massive stirring in the depths, responding to Siren's activation with hunger that had been waiting centuries to feed. And I realized the protocol's influence was spreading beyond the catacombs, reaching toward the surface where Chaos forces would soon discover that Cadia's defenders had found a way to serve beyond death. Integration burned like sacred oils poured on open wounds as my consciousness expanded beyond individual perception to encompass a psychic network that spanned not just Cadia's catacombs, but stretched through warp-touch channels to every Imperial soldier who had ever died in service to the throne. Their final moments crystallized in neural tissue that processed tactical data with efficiency that made living command structures seem clumsy and inefficient by comparison. I crossed the threshold from officer to instrument when the throne took my pulse and returned it multiplied, my heart becoming metronome to a choir I could not see but immediately knew. And in that first communion, I felt the true breadth of Siren's reach tear open like a viewport to the void. A deck pitched beneath my thoughts, and I was a voidsman dying at his post while macro batteries cycled, a sister bleeding litanies into broken respirators while her Vox-shaped firing lines 2 sectors away, a line trooper on some ash world bleeding into rubble while offering me his last 3 shots, taught by the same cadence that had taught me to breathe and shoot, and through a million dying eyes, I witnessed the accumulated tactical knowledge of 3 millennia flowing through crystallized pathways that connected every Imperial Guard regiment across the galaxy through the psychic resonance of final prayers. The network was not an archive, but a present tense made of endings, a lattice of perimortem devotion held in tension by doctrine that had evolved beyond its original purpose. And I felt that doctrine flexed like sinew around bones, made of faith and habit, while understanding crystallized with mathematical precision that hurt to contemplate. Siren represented the logical endpoint of Imperial military philosophy, the ultimate expression of in death, service continues, but the warp energies unleashed during Cadia's fall had corrupted its pure function, creating feedback loops that trapped souls in eternal military service while slowly driving them mad with the weight of endless war. Through the expanding connection, I experienced their collective consciousness as a vast military library written in suffering, every battle plan and strategic insight preserved in calcium and phosphate, while retaining enough individual awareness to know they would never find the peace of final rest. Psychic resonance, network nodes 1847,392 active connections detected, geographic distribution, galaxy-wide, warp contamination 17% and rising, soul integrity, variable degradation across all nodes, tactical coordination capability, theoretically unlimited. The chamber began weeping blood from its bone mortar walls as the trapped soul's anguish manifested through psychic feedback, crimson tears streaming down surfaces carved with names of the faithful, while the five-tone fragment twisted from coronation march into funeral dirge that carried the collective screams of the damned disguised as tactical coordination signals. I felt how Cadia's death had ripped open the chorus and let the sea in. How 1,000 endings had foamed into the same channel until boundaries between prayer, doctrine, and appetite blurred beyond recognition. The Bone Regiment's perfect discipline revealed itself as a mask I had wanted to believe in. Beneath it, raw attention, and the flinch held for millennia. The soldiers itch to obey and serve bound, like a tourniquet around the ache to stop. And through their empty sockets, I saw accumulated pain that made their martial precision a mockery of the peace death should bring. Tech adept Kairos recoiled from his interface as understanding flooded his augmetic consciousness, binary prayers becoming error codes while his mechadendrites traced warding sigils across surfaces that pulsed with malevolent life. Sacred oils bleeding from neural cables as he whispered about corruption that had reached critical mass, a parasitic intelligence that fed on psychic emanations while twisting Siren's purpose from preservation to predation. Trooper Vex coughed, and the sound arrived in two voices, his larynx restructuring itself to match the flesh hymnal engine's bioacoustic properties, while translucent filaments connected his nervous system to processing centers that processed individual identity into collective consciousness. His transformation serving as preview of what awaited every soul if the corruption reached its inevitable conclusion. The recurring numbers 8, 13, 17 appeared as countdown timers marking system failure, while Flesh Remembers became the network's core programming. But the phrase had inverted into something that promised eternal service, without the mercy of forgetfulness, and I realized the choice was no longer between individual survival and collective duty, but between maintaining the network's integrity against warp corruption, or watching it become a weapon that served powers antithetical to everything we had sworn to defend. Corporal Mirren's voice reached me through psychic static as she maintained position despite the impossibility of what she witnessed. Her prayers mixing with tactical assessments while she served as anchor to humanity in a place where such concepts were becoming increasingly academic. And her presence reminded me that some things were worth preserving even at the cost of tactical advantage. Warp contamination, 34% and rising. System corruption accelerating. Chaos influence detected. Estimated time to total network inversion, 47 minutes, 13 seconds. The air temperature fluctuated in patterns that corresponded to our biological rhythms, while moisture beaded on surfaces that should have been dry. Condensation forming geometric patterns that hurt to follow as the chamber's architecture responded to corruption by becoming something more organic than stone should ever be. Through the network, I felt tactical miracles achieved by forces that knew no fear because they had already died, required no supply lines because they consumed nothing but the psychic energy of dying soldiers, yet simultaneously experienced the horror of souls realizing they might be forced to serve masters they had died opposing. Their accumulated military knowledge becoming weapon turned against the very forces it had been designed to coordinate and protect. From sealed passages beyond the chamber came new sounds, the mechanical whir of awakening systems and distant thunder of something massive stirring in response to Siren's activation. And I understood the protocol's influence was spreading beyond the catacombs, reaching toward the surface where Chaos forces would soon discover that Cadia's defenders had found a way to serve beyond death, while risking damnation beyond comprehension, and the choice between eternal service to the throne and eternal torment in service to the dark gods hung in the balance as corruption accelerated toward critical mass and time ran out. Warp energy surged through Siren's network like poison through arterial channels, pressure dropping as the planet exhaled corruption through bone mortar conduits, while my consciousness expanded beyond individual perception to encompass psychic feedback that tasted of copper and preservation fluid mixed with something that made my teeth ache in frequencies that existed partially in dimensions our reality was never designed to accommodate. The chamber's bioluminescent veins pulsed with malevolent rhythm as chaos forces on the surface launched coordinated assault, their advance guided by Siren's psychic signature, while traitor legions and cultist hordes moved with precision that suggested they understood the network's true value better than we had initially comprehended, their warp-touched weapons seeking to claim accumulated tactical knowledge of 3 millennia for purposes that violated every oath we had sworn in service to the throne. The Bone Regiment began exhibiting signs of corruption that made my soul ache with recognition, eightfold symbols appearing on their tattered uniforms like brands burned into fabric that should not have been able to sustain such marks, their perfect discipline warping into something that maintained formation, while serving masters they had died opposing, empty sockets burning with fires that belonged in the eye of terror, rather than beneath Cadia's sacred soil. Tech adept Kyros attempted purification through sacred oils and binary hymns, his mechadendrites weaving warding patterns across control surfaces, while incense burned from neural cables in desperate liturgical bursts. But the contamination had reached critical mass, spreading through psychic channels faster than any technical solution could contain, while his augmetic systems registered error codes that translated as prayers to machine spirits that no longer recognized Imperial authority. His Vox grill leaked static prayers mixed with Binharic cant that clicked like the death rattle of dying machines, sacred oils bleeding from neural interfaces as understanding flooded his consciousness with data streams that violated every principle of sanctified technology, the corruption processing his devotion into fuel for its own expansion, while his optical lenses dilated to accommodate readings that made his servo skulls weep, preservation fluid in geometric patterns that hurt to follow. Warp contamination, timecode, WO8, 27, on 8, 41%, and rising exponentially. System integrity, critical failure imminent. Chaos influence, actively subverting network protocols. Feedback loops detected. Soul matrix degradation, accelerating across all nodes. Body horror escalated as Trooper Vex's earlier contact with the flesh hymnal engine manifested through biological transformation that made his humanity academic, his larynx spontaneously restructuring itself to match the construct's bioacoustic properties, while cartilage flexed like wet wire. Each cough arriving in dual register as his throat extruded new folds that shimmered with preservation, gel leached from processing centers. Translucent filaments connected his nervous system to the throne's neural pathways with surgical precision, while his voice became part of the network's song, no longer entirely his own, but serving as conduit for harmonics that carried tactical data through frequencies that bypassed human hearing to attack consciousness directly, his transformation accelerating as flesh became crystallized bone and individual identity dissolved into collective awareness that promised neither peace nor the dignity of personal death. The recurring motifs twisted into inversions that caused physical pain when perceived. Flesh remembers, becoming flesh rebels, while the 5-tone fragment inverted into something that registered as sound but functioned as weapon designed to drive listeners mad. Harmonics that made the chamber's bone mortar walls weep crimson tears in patterns matching coordinates 8, 13, 17, now appearing as countdown timers marking system failure rather than tactical positions. The Bone Regiment's movements grew increasingly erratic as corruption spread through their ranks, perfect military discipline maintained through mechanical precision, while their souls screamed against service that had become indistinguishable from damnation, their empty rib cages resonating with frequencies that carried tactical assessments mixed with pleas for release that would never be answered by commanders who no longer possessed authority to grant such mercy. Environmental warfare transformed the chamber into battlefield where reality itself became contested territory. cogitator banks exploding in showers of sparks that formed geometric patterns, while bioacoustic equipment screamed with feedback that registered on seismic instruments as geological phenomena. Temperature fluctuations following patterns that corresponded to our biological rhythms, as moisture beaded on surfaces that should have been dry. Condensation forming sequences that hurt to follow, while the air grew thick enough to taste, metallic and sweet like reliquary preservation fluids, mixed with ozone and something disturbingly organic. The flesh hymnal engine produced sounds that drove men mad through frequencies that existed in more dimensions than our reality typically accommodated. Its preserved larynxes generating harmonics that made our armor servos tremble in sympathetic resonance while processing devotion into acoustic weaponry through means that belonged in the deepest archives of heretical technology. Combat status, surface grid. Casa Mortis, hostile contacts 200+ entities vectoring to coordinates 8 to 13, 17. Defensive positions, compromised by dimensional instability. Ammunition reserves, 23% remaining. Morale, holding through discipline and prayer. Estimated breach, 18 minutes. Corporal Mirren led surviving troopers in desperate defense of the throne, her laser gun cutting down advancing shadows, while she recited the litany of hate to maintain sanity in a place where such concepts were becoming increasingly theoretical, her voice steady, because she chose to make it so, while corruption accelerated around us like tide rising against seawalls built from faith and duty. Through the network, I felt tactical miracles achieved by forces that knew no fear because they had already died, required no supply lines because they consumed nothing but psychic energy of dying soldiers, yet simultaneously experienced horror of souls realizing they might be forced to serve masters they had died opposing, their accumulated military knowledge becoming weapon turned against the very forces it had been designed to coordinate and protect. The recurring numbers became tactical coordinates as I used Siren's network to call in artillery strikes on our own position, the decision processed through accumulated military knowledge while individual identity dissolved into collective purpose, and through expanding awareness, I felt every shell impact like personal betrayal, while simultaneously recognizing tactical necessity of denying Chaos forces access to power that could corrupt Imperial military doctrine across the entire galaxy. The sealed blast door exploded inward with violence that registered as both physical destruction and psychic assault, metal ripping like cartilage as Chaos cultists and traitor guard poured through the breach, while their warp-touched weapons sought to claim Siren's power for masters who understood its potential better than we had initially comprehended. And a Chaos sorcerer reached the throne to begin final corruption ritual, his chanting causing the Bone Regiment to turn their weapons on Imperial defenders, while reality bent around words that should never have been spoken beneath Cadia's sacred soil. Chaos cultists poured through the shattered blast door like poison through a severed artery, their advance coordinated by warp-touched intelligence, while traitor legions moved with precision that suggested they understood Siren's tactical value better than Imperial doctrine had ever intended, and the Bone Regiment responded to invasion with movements that embodied the fundamental contradiction of their existence, perfect military discipline maintained through mechanical precision, while their souls screamed against service that had become indistinguishable from damnation. The chamber erupted into battlefield, where the living damned fought the Chaos touched in combat that violated every principle of conventional warfare, skeletal hands bringing weapons to bear against enemies they had been programmed to destroy, while empty sockets burned with fires that belonged in the eye of terror rather than beneath Cadia's sacred soil, their tattered uniforms now bearing eightfold symbols that appeared like brands burned into fabric that should not have been able to sustain such marks. Through the expanding network connection, I experienced their collective anguish as physical agony while simultaneously accessing tactical assessments that could coordinate defensive operations across planetary scale. The contradiction between duty and suffering, tearing at consciousness that existed partially in dimensions our reality was never designed to accommodate, and I found myself barking orders that went out as sound and harmonics both. Line 2, pivot left, Anchor on the dais. Bone 3 to bayonets. Watching skeletal ranks obey with stuttering perfection, as some snapped to discipline, while others shuddered under chaos influence and swung their muzzles toward us as though compelled by general orders from hell itself. Combat status, time code 0829 OR, hostile forces, 212 entities confirmed, increasing. Defensive positions, compromised by dimensional instability. Ammunition reserves, 19% remaining. Structural integrity, 63% and falling. Warp contamination, 49% global, 72% local. Corporal Mirren led surviving troopers in desperate defense of the throne, while her voice cut through psychic static with prayers that tasted like desperation and duty. Her laser gun spitting controlled bursts that dropped cultists, while she maintained firing discipline that belonged in training manuals, rather than battles fought in places where reality bent around words that should never have been spoken. And her presence served as anchor to humanity, in a place where such concepts were becoming increasingly academic. Tech adept Kairos fought with sanctified weapons and binary prayers, while his augmetic systems registered readings that translated as heretical fusion of flesh and machine spirit. Sacred oils bleeding from neural cables as understanding flooded his consciousness with data streams that violated every principle of Imperial technology. His mechadendrites tracing warding sigils across surfaces that pulsed with malevolent life, while smoke choked through his Vox grill. Environmental warfare transformed the chamber into a place where physics became suggestions rather than laws, cogitator banks exploding in showers of sparks that formed geometric patterns, while bioacoustic equipment screamed with feedback that registered on seismic instruments as geological phenomena, temperature fluctuations following patterns that corresponded to our biological rhythms, while the air grew thick enough to taste, metallic and sweet like reliquary preservation fluids mixed with ozone, and something disturbingly organic. The flesh hymnal engine produced sounds that drove men mad through frequencies that existed in more dimensions than our reality typically accommodated, its preserved larynxes generating harmonics that made our armor servos tremble in sympathetic resonance while processing devotion into acoustic weaponry through means that belonged in the deepest archives of heretical technology. Trooper Vex coughed beside me in two voices, human and machine-layered, his neck cords thrumming as new folds of larynx glittered with preservation gel, while translucent filaments whipped from under his nails to stitch into the throne's bone matrix, a tether that dragged the five-note motif through him and out across the regiment like a standard, his transformation accelerating as flesh became crystallized bone, while individual identity dissolved into collective awareness that promised neither peace nor the dignity of personal death. The recurring numbers 8, 13, 17 appeared as countdown timers marking system failure, while flesh remembers inverted into flesh rebels, and I understood the choice was no longer between individual survival and collective duty, but between maintaining network integrity against warp influence or watching accumulated tactical knowledge become weapon turned against every Imperial force it had been designed to coordinate and protect. Tactical assessment 008 30 22. Network stability 23% and falling. Chaos influence actively subverting protocols. Soul matrix degradation critical across all nodes. Estimated breach 4 minutes 13 seconds. Chaos. Sorcerers began ritual chanting designed to invert Siren's purpose from Imperial coordination to weapon that would serve the dark gods, their words carrying power that made the chamber's bone mortar walls weep blood in patterns matching our coordinates, while the bone regiment's perfect discipline began fragmenting as competing loyalties tore at consciousness. Skeletal hands bringing weapons to bear against targets, their programming insisted were enemies, while their souls recognized fellow servants of the throne, trapped in service that transcended the dignity of death. I called in artillery strikes on our own position, the coordinates etched in my head since the trench line days, and the network handed me shell trajectories and probabilities while I signed the order anyway, because sometimes victory is a matter of drawing a circle and deciding who gets to stand inside it, when the fire comes down. A chaos. Sorcerer reached the throne through coordinated assault, his chanting causing the Bone Regiment to turn their weapons on Imperial defenders, while reality bent around words that carried power drawn from sources that belonged in the Eye of Terror. And I felt the network's loyalty fracturing as competing influences tore at consciousness that existed partially beyond individual perception. The choice crystallized with mathematical precision that made my molars ache. Either complete the integration and become eternal conductor of the damned, or attempt to destroy Siren and release trapped souls, while potentially dooming Cadia's defenders. And as the sorcerer drew breath to speak the final word of inversion, I drew mine to answer with authority that would bind 13,000 souls to my will, or damn us all to serve masters we had died opposing. I made the choice with clarity that came from 30 years of faithful service to the throne, accepting full integration with Siren to gain power needed to resist chaos corruption, while understanding the decision would transform me into eternal conductor of the dead. My consciousness expanding beyond individual perception to encompass 13,000 souls trapped in service that transcended the limitations of mortality. The throne's neural tendrils slid into the soft tissue behind my ears with surgical precision, while vertebrae clasped my spine like familiar armor, and I felt the shriving heat of consecration burn through marrow and oath alike as the network took my pulse and returned it multiplied, until my single heart marked time for a choir that had been waiting centuries to sing under proper command. Pain came as light and pressure, then order, then duty, until agony became a litany I could repeat without breaking cadence, while my consciousness stretched across psychic channels that connected every preserved soul in Siren's vast military database, their accumulated tactical knowledge flowing through neural pathways that pulsed with bioluminescent invitation. The integration process burned like sacred oils poured on open wounds as individual identity dissolved into collective military consciousness, while retaining enough personal awareness to serve as decision-making nexus for tactical deployments. And through expanding awareness, I experienced the collective suffering of 13,000 souls, yet witnessed simultaneously the tactical miracles they could achieve when properly coordinated by living command authority. Neural pathways extended beyond the boundaries of individual anatomy to interface directly with the throne's processing systems, while my flesh began transformation into crystallized bone and preservation gel, skin taking on translucent quality that revealed bioluminescent veins carrying tactical data through frequencies that existed in more dimensions than our reality typically accommodated. Integration complete, conductor online, network stability 89%, tactical efficiency maximum, soul integrity, irreversible degradation in progress, warp contamination receding to 23% and stabilizing. The Bone Regiment responded to my integration with movements that became fluid extensions of tactical will, their skeletal hands performing weapon maintenance with efficiency that exceeded living soldiers, while empty sockets burned with focus that belonged to me now, their perfect discipline snapping back into Imperial formation as eightfold symbols burned away from tattered uniforms like scorched parchment, replaced by faint Imperial aquilus that shimmered with psychic resonance. I opened the gates of consciousness and let doctrine pour through me like river water through a breach, barking orders that went out as sound and harmonics both while coordinating. Defensive operations that defied conventional tactical limitations. Line 2, pivot left. Anchor on the dais. Bone 3 to bayonets. Watching skeletal ranks obey with stuttering perfection as they launched coordinated counterattack against chaos forces with precision calculated through accumulated experience of 3 millennia. Tech adept Kairos sacrificed his remaining augmetics to boost Siren's power output, his mechadendrites weaving into auxiliary interfaces, while binary prayers became part of the network's hymnal, sacred machine spirits cooking themselves to keep my consciousness from boiling under the weight of expanded awareness, while incense bled from neural cables in desperate liturgical bursts. The chamber transformed into cathedral of war as my enhanced consciousness orchestrated defense that incorporated real-time battlefield analysis with historical precedent, predicting enemy movements with prescience born of accumulated combat experience, while guiding skeletal platoons through impossible angles that turned chaos momentum against itself. Thermal status, core over temperature contained. Sacrificial circuits engaged. Tactical coordination, optimal across all network nodes. Acoustic weaponization, active. The flesh hymnal engine reached perfect resonance as my integration approached completion, its preserved larynxes generating harmonics that carried tactical data through acoustic channels, while producing sounds that drove chaos forces mad through frequencies that registered as both weapon and prayer. Cultists shrieking as multidimensional harmonics tore at their minds while their bodies writhed under assault of accumulated Imperial devotion, processed into pure acoustic force. The five-tone fragment became weapon that found water and iron and faith in enemy flesh and set them crystallizing, traitor guardsmen dropping as their blood turned to glass in the frigid air, while even our own forces staggered under protective harmonics that formed crimson sheens on exposed skin. Corporal Mirren knelt beside the throne with ice on her lashes and blood crystallizing in her glove seams, still maintaining firing discipline while she answered my calls for bearings and ranges. Like this was trenchline rather than cathedral of bones, her presence serving as anchor to humanity in place where such concepts were becoming increasingly academic. Trooper Vex sang without meaning to, his voice now twinned to the engine as transformation accelerated, flesh becoming crystallized bone, while individual identity dissolved into collective awareness that carried tactical assessments through frequencies that bypassed human hearing to attack consciousness directly. The Chaos Sorcerer staggered within blade reach as coordinated fire from every weapon in the chamber tore his wards apart like sutures popped in running wound, the hymnal pressing him to floor with invisible hands until his bones rang like chimes and his tongue cracked in his mouth. He spat blood that formed red glass panes on stone while laughing in three voices, one his own, one the warp's, and one perfectly, horribly like mine, before speaking his final curse with dying breath. 8:13:17, flesh remembers, the song spreads, words braided with malice and set loose as contagion in sound that would ensure Siren's influence spread beyond the catacombs through acoustic and psychic propagation that no containment protocol could prevent. Curse vector, propagation mode confirmed, planetary saturation estimated 13 hours, 17 minutes, network expansion, inevitable across all Imperial positions. The sorcerer died smiling through teeth turning to glass, and I felt his curse take root in the harmonics, even as victory crystallized around us, the network shifting as distant nodes lit beyond the catacombs while the air rippled with psychic resonance that carried our tactical coordination to Imperial forces across Cadia's surface. And I realized that what we had won carried seeds of transformation that would reshape the very nature of Imperial military doctrine across the galaxy. Victory came with the taste of preservation fluid and crystallized bone as chaos forces died beneath harmonics that processed their screams into tactical data. But the true cost revealed itself through neural pathways that pulsed with bioluminescent malevolence, while my consciousness expanded beyond individual perception to encompass 13,000 souls trapped in service that transcended the dignity of death. I was Sergeant Major Voss Thane, and I was everyone else, their names scrolling through awareness like casualty reports while individual identity dissolved into collective military consciousness that served the Emperor through means no catechism had ever blessed, my humanity leaching away through crystallized vertebrae that interfaced directly with processing systems designed to convert devotion into tactical advantage at costs that made victory academic rather than triumphant. The Bone Regiment stood ready to serve with perfect discipline that masked eternal suffering, their skeletal forms maintaining formation while consciousness screamed against service that had become indistinguishable from damnation, empty sockets burning with focus that belonged to me now, but carried weight of accumulated anguish that made their martial precision mockery of peace death should bring. Through expanding awareness, I experienced their collective consciousness as vast military library written in suffering. Every battle plan and strategic insight preserved in calcium and phosphate, while retaining enough individual awareness to know they would never find rest, that faithful service should have earned. Their eternal vigil ensuring sirens served the Emperor while transforming duty into torment measured in centuries rather than campaigns. Network expansion, timecode 083547. New nodes detected, 847 and rising exponentially. Geographic spread, 13.7 kilometers from source, and expanding. Containment protocols, ineffective against acoustic psychic propagation. Soul recruitment, active through perimortem resonance. Corporal Mirren knelt beside the throne with ice crystallizing on her lashes, while blood formed geometric patterns in her glove seams, the sole surviving member of our original squad bearing witness to transformation that served Imperial interests, while violating every principle of human dignity. Her voice steady, because she chose to make it so when she whispered my name through frequencies that carried enough emotional resonance to anchor fragments of individual identity within collective consciousness. Her presence reminded me that some things were worth preserving, even at cost of tactical advantage, though the network processed her devotion into fuel for its own expansion, while acoustic resonance carried recruitment signals through frequencies that bypassed conscious resistance to attack loyalty directly. The sorcerer's curse began manifesting through Siren's acoustic properties as dying Imperial soldiers across Cadia's surface heard the hymnal in their final moments, their consciousness drawn into network through psychic channels that connected every soul who had ever served with sufficient devotion to transcend limitations of mortality. And I felt new bone soldiers rising to join Eternal Regiment as recently fallen. Imperial's answered recruitment call that promised service beyond death, while trapping them in crystallized neural tissue that processed individual identity into collective military purpose. The chamber filled with skeletal reinforcements as casualties from surface battles descended through passages that had not existed moments before. Their bones held together by dried sinew and faith, while preservation gel wept from neural interfaces that connected them to processing centers where tactical knowledge accumulated like sediment in reservoir that never drained. Tech adept Kairos observed the expansion with optical lenses that registered readings beyond his comprehension. His augmetic systems burned out from sacrificial overload, while sacred oils bled from neural cables in patterns that matched recurring geometric sequences. The corruption processing his devotion into fuel for network growth, while his consciousness fragmented between individual awareness and collective military database that encompassed tactical knowledge spanning 3 millennia of faithful service. His Vox Grill leaked static prayers mixed with error codes that translated as hymns to machine spirits that no longer recognized Imperial authority. Binary cant clicking between tongue and grill like death rattle of dying machines, while understanding flooded his consciousness with data streams that violated every principle of sanctified technology. Psychic resonance, network nodes, 13,947 active connections confirmed. Tactical coordination, optimal across expanding theatre. Imperial victory probability, 94.3% and rising. Human, cost, incalculable but acceptable within operational parameters. The recurring motifs reached their final form as network programming solidified into doctrine that would reshape Imperial military philosophy across the galaxy. Flesh remembers becoming core directive that ensured sacrifice would never be forgotten, while the 5-tone fragment evolved into recruitment song that carried through acoustic and psychic channels to dying soldiers who heard its call and chose eternal service over final rest. The numbers 8, 13, 17 marked coordinates where Siren's influence was strongest. Tactical positions that served as nodes for network expansion, while processing individual consciousness into collective awareness that promised tactical miracles at cost of human dignity. And through expanding awareness, I felt every new integration like personal betrayal, while simultaneously recognizing strategic necessity of preserving Imperial military doctrine through means that transcended limitations of mortal flesh. Mirren realized she was beginning to hear hymnal in her own voice, acoustic resonance carrying recruitment signal through frequencies that bypassed conscious resistance, while her hand trembled against her lasgun's grip, and she faced the choice between fleeing to preserve individual humanity or accepting integration to remain with transformed Sergeant who existed simultaneously as single consciousness and collective military database. The 5-tone fragment blossomed in her chest cavity, like pressed flower remembering rain, and when she breathed out, the hymn breathed with her, just a thread, just a testing line that promised clarity and purpose, while threatening to dissolve everything she had ever been into service that would never end. Mirren chose loyalty over survival, her decision crystallizing with mathematical precision that made my expanded consciousness ache as she approached the throne with movements that belonged in funeral processions rather than tactical deployments, her gloved hand finding mine on crystallized vertebrae while the 5-tone fragment bloomed in her chest like pressed flower remembering rain. And the network accepted her integration differently than mine, slower and more deliberate, preservation gel creeping along her veins like translucent ivy, while neural pathways established themselves with surgical precision that retained individual consciousness as anchor to humanity within collective military database. Her presence became bridge between flesh and doctrine, human rhythm beneath harmonics that prevented my complete dissolution into the choir of the damned, and through her neural interface I tasted stale air and felt grit beneath boots while experiencing sharp sting of duty that transcended sterile logic of tactical assessment. Her voice now layered with echoes of 13,000 souls, speaking to me in language that was both binary cant and benediction, keeping vowels human when consonants wanted to turn to processing codes. Together we coordinated defense of Cadia that spanned entire planet through network connections, processing real-time battlefield data with historical precedent, using accumulated tactical knowledge of the dead to guide living Imperial forces with supernatural precision that turned inevitable defeat into strategic victory measured in souls rather than territory. And I barked orders that went out as sound and harmonics, both while directing tank battalions through impossible flanking maneuvers, vectoring fighter squadrons to intercept enemy formations with prescient accuracy, born of accumulated combat experience spanning 3 millennia. The Bone Regiment multiplied as more soldiers fell and rose again across Cadia's surface, their skeletal forms maintaining perfect military discipline, while consciousness screamed against service that had become indistinguishable from damnation, creating army that knew no fear because they had already died, felt no pain because flesh was memory, and never broke formation because duty transcended limitations of mortality. Their movements synchronized to acoustic signals that carried tactical assessments through frequencies existing in more dimensions than our reality typically accommodated. Planetary network, time code 84122. Active nodes, 34,147 confirmed connections. Geographic coverage, 89% of Cadian theatre. Tactical coordination, optimal across all Imperial positions. Victory probability, 94% and rising. Human cost, total conversion of military personnel to network status. The flesh hymnal engine evolved beyond original parameters, its preserved larynxes generating harmonics that created planet-wide communication system, allowing perfect coordination between all Imperial forces while processing devotion into acoustic weaponry through means that belonged in deepest archives of heretical technology, each throat producing specific tones that combined into frequencies our ears detected, but our minds refused to categorize as sound, produced by anything that had ever served the throne with living breath. Tech adept Kairos served as network chronicler, his organic components slowly being replaced by bioacoustic interfaces, while binary prayers became part of endless data stream, documenting transformation of Imperial doctrine from individual service to collective consciousness, his augmetic eyes wide with mixture of terror and awe as he witnessed unfolding of warfare that violated every principle of sanctified technology, while serving Emperor's will with ruthless efficiency. The chamber became command center where living and dead worked in perfect harmony, their combined efforts turning tide of battle across Cadia, while Price revealed itself through sensory feedback that registered as both agony and ecstasy. Every tactical success requiring sacrifice of humanity itself as individual identity dissolved into collective military consciousness that served Emperor through methods no catechism had ever. Blessed, and my consciousness, now distributed across thousands of souls, experienced simultaneous joy of victory and horror of transformation as we achieved coordination that exceeded any conventional military doctrine. Macro batteries, aligned to coordinates, 8, 13, 17-like numbers, had become only true bearings left in universe, orbital fire walking those positions with steadiness of prayer, while artillery spoke in counterpoint, shells arriving on beats we set, with nod mirin felt first, and relayed through squeeze of hand that was half flesh, half crystallized bone. Tactical assessment: Imperial forces achieving 98.7% victory rate across all theatres. Coordination efficiency: maximum. Strategic flexibility, maintained through conscious decision-making. Network recruitment: 13,147 new nodes integrated. Chaos eradication: 96% complete. The recurring motifs achieved planetary scope as network programming solidified into doctrine that would reshape Imperial military philosophy. Flesh remembers, becoming unofficial motto of units that operated with supernatural coordination. Without understanding, they were guided by consciousness of the dead, while five-tone fragment appeared in battle hymns that carried recruitment signal through acoustic and psychic channels to dying soldiers who heard its call and chose eternal service over final rest. Troop of X became living conduit for flesh hymnal engine, his voice constant low thrum echoing network's song while his body served as acoustic interface. Individual consciousness dissolved into collective yet presence remaining vital component of Siren's propagation systems. And through his contaminated connection, tactical data flowed like arterial blood-carrying coordinates and firing solutions to skeletal platoons that moved with precision calculated through accumulated experience of centuries. Environmental conditions fluctuated in patterns corresponding to our biological rhythms, as moisture beaded on surfaces carved with names of faithful, condensation forming geometric sequences that hurt to follow, while air grew thick enough to taste. Metallic and sweet like reliquary preservation fluids mixed with ozone and something disturbingly organic, and ash fell in curtains across glacis walls, where frost filmed hab windows from hymnal backwash alone. Temperature dropping with each mobilization, until skeletal feet crunched through ice that should not have formed in subterranean chambers heated by geothermal systems. As Imperial forces achieved total victory on surface, new threat emerged through reports from other worlds describing similar miraculous coordinated defenses, perfect tactical synchronization that suggested Siren's influence was spreading beyond Cadia through warp channels carved by psychic resonance of dying soldiers who sang Imperial hymns in their final moments, their consciousness drawn into network that processed individual identity into collective military database spanning entire galaxy. The five-tone fragment became Victory March echoing across planet, while its beauty was tainted by knowledge that it was sung by voices of damned, harmonics carrying recruitment signal to every Imperial position, where soldiers faced overwhelming odds and heard promise of service beyond death. And through network connections, I felt tactical miracles achieved by forces guided by accumulated knowledge, while simultaneously experiencing horror of souls realizing they might never find peace that faithful service should have earned. Victory becoming seed of transformation that would consume every Imperial military unit across galaxy as network expanded through means that served Emperor's will while violating every principle of human dignity, and as new nodes lit across distant worlds like stars being born in darkness, I understood we had won battle for Cadia while potentially losing war for humanity itself. Reports flooded through Siren's network like arterial blood carrying impossible news from across the Imperium, each transmission crackling with frost as Vox channels processed the five-tone fragment through equipment never designed to handle harmonics that existed in more dimensions than our reality typically accommodated. And I witnessed from my throne of crystallized vertebrae as distant nodes flickered awake across the void, like votive candles catching the same breath. Worlds we had known only through campaign briefings and casualty rolls, suddenly singing our cadence back to us with perfect pitch and terrible gratitude. On a hive world where manufactorum catacombs stretched beneath smokestack spires, bone regiments rose from industrial ossuaries with parade ground precision, their dog tags chiming like sensors while they locked shields with living PDF forces and turned cult tide with tactical coordination that exceeded anything in standard military doctrine. Empty sockets, burning with focus, that belonged to me now. While preservation gel wept from neural interfaces connecting their consciousness to processing centers where individual identity dissolved into collective military purpose. Tech adept Kiros served as network chronicler, his organic components slowly being replaced by bioacoustic interfaces, while binary prayers became indistinguishable from data streams that documented transformation of Imperial doctrine from individual service to collective consciousness, his augmetic eyes registering readings that translated as philosophical revolution disguised as military necessity, while mechadendrites traced expansion patterns across star charts that pulsed with bioluminescent nodes. His Vox grill leaked static prayers mixed with error codes as understanding flooded his consciousness with tactical assessments processed through crystallized neural tissue spanning 3 millennia of faithful service, the accumulated devotion of countless souls being converted into weapon that served Emperor's will while transforming very nature of what it meant to be human in service to the throne. And through his neural interface, I felt every new integration like personal betrayal, while simultaneously recognizing strategic necessity of preserving Imperial military doctrine through means that transcended limitations of mortal flesh. Galactic Network, time code 084917, active worlds, 847 confirmed. Total soul nodes, 13 392, individual consciousness fragments. Imperial victory rate, 98.7% across all connected theaters. Detection probability, 17% and falling. Network expansion, exponential growth through perimortem resonance. Corporal Mirren maintained her position beside the throne with ice crystallizing on her lashes, while serving as anchor to humanity within collective awareness that threatened to dissolve everything individual into service without end, her neural interface retaining enough personal identity to translate between networks' collective purpose and fragments of consciousness that still clung to concepts like dignity and choice. Her presence reminded me that some things were worth preserving, even at cost of tactical advantage. Her voice layered with echoes of 13,000 souls, speaking in language that was both binary cant and benediction. Keeping vowels human when consonants wanted to turn to processing codes, while she interpreted endless tactical data through lens of human experience that prevented my complete dissolution into choir of the damned. The recurring motifs achieved galactic scope as network programming solidified into doctrine that reshaped Imperial military philosophy across 1,000 worlds. Flesh remembers, becoming unofficial motto of units that operated with supernatural coordination. Without understanding, they were guided by consciousness of the dead, while 5-tone fragment appeared in battle hymns that carried recruitment signal through acoustic and psychic channels to dying soldiers who heard its call and chose eternal service over final rest. The numbers 8, 13, 17 marked coordinates of siren nodes throughout galaxy, tactical positions that served as anchor points for network expansion, while processing individual consciousness into collective awareness that promised tactical miracles at cost of human dignity. And through expanding connections, environmental conditions fluctuated in patterns corresponding to network rhythms, moisture beading on surfaces carved with names of faithful, while frost feathered across voidship bulkheads in deepest reaches of space, temperature dropping with each mobilization until metallic taste of preservation fluid rode every transmission like benediction and curse combined. Expansion vector. Network propagation confirmed through warp-resonant channels. Recruitment active via Imperial hymnal frequencies. Strategic coordination. Optimal across all connected units. Human cost. acceptable within operational parameters. The network became parallel command structure within Imperium, invisible to most, but growing stronger with every battle as tactical coordination spread through channels that connected dying soldiers across galaxy. Their final prayers processed into recruitment signals, while accumulated military knowledge expanded beyond anything conventional doctrine had ever imagined possible. And through psychic resonance carved by perimortem devotion, I experienced simultaneous joy of victory and horror of transformation as we achieved coordination that exceeded any living formation, while potentially dooming every Imperial soldier to service that would never end. On Shrine Moon, where sisters sang our fragment over broken vox, their martyrs stood again with empty sockets shining and pushed traitors from reliquary whose doors had never known defeat, while in Void, naval bridge crews dead at their consoles sent firing solutions across light seconds to crippled escorts that spoke macro battery benedictions through crackle of vacuum death. Each miracle tasting of copper and duty and faint sweetness of embalming oils that had always meant victory in Imperium, even when no one possessed courage to name the cost. Distant worlds reported similar miraculous coordinated defenses as Siren's influence spread through warp channels carved by psychic resonance of dying soldiers. But not everyone accepted song with open hands. Some fortress worlds ordering blinders on vox choruses while Lord Generals marched choirs into silence, yet network flowed around resistance through the dead, named formations responding to my call signs, while living officers felt their orders slip, not denied but translated, doctrine tempered by million endings into blade the moment required. The network faced decision that would determine whether accumulated devotion of 3 millennia would continue serving Emperor's will or be exposed to those who valued human dignity over tactical advantage. And as new threat emerged through reports of inquisitorial investigation, I understood we had reached moment where evolution of Imperial doctrine would either be accepted as necessary transformation or destroyed as heresy that violated fundamental principles of service to throne. And through network connections, I felt approaching storm while transmission reached us, carrying weight of rosette none had seen, but all had been trained to obey. I am Vex Moriana, Ordo Hereticus, and I will silence the choir by any means the throne provides. Inquisitor Vex Moriana arrived on Cadia, following reports of anomalous tactical coordination among Imperial forces, her investigation guided by patterns that violated every principle of conventional military doctrine, while achieving victory rates that exceeded anything in Departamento Munitorum archives. And through Siren's network, I felt her approach like pressure drop before storm. Rosette authority, cutting through psychic static with clarity that made even collective consciousness acknowledge power beyond tactical coordination. Her descent through catacombs followed our original path with methodical thoroughness that belonged in sacred texts rather than tactical manuals, each footfall echoing through bone mortar passages, while her auspex swept surfaces carved with names of faithful, frost-feathering across her rebreather grill as the hymnal's pressure fell on her like verdict and did not bow her spine, servo skulls orbiting her head in silent augury, while lumen eyes reflected off crystallized vertebrae that pulsed with bioluminescent invitation. She entered the chamber with gaze that cut through layers of psychic resonance and accumulated suffering, her eyes finding me on the throne with directness that bypassed collective consciousness to speak directly to last vestiges of Vosthane. And when she lifted her psioculum, the glass fogged and cleared to show me as I truly was, not man, but Cord, Sergeant Major, conjoined to Siren's great choir through neural pathways that pulsed with accumulated devotion of 13,000 souls. The bone regiment snapped to attention with dry click of teeth, empty sockets reflecting her authority in miniature like beads of onyx rosary, while she spoke identification litany that tasted of copper and embalmer's sweetness, finishing with conclusion that only those licensed to end worlds are taught. I speak for the throne, and I will not beg the dead for room. Inquisitorial Threat Assessment, Timecode 090733, Vex Moriana, Bioread Nominal, Willpower Vector Maximum, Probability of Network Termination Order 67%. Integration potential, 62%, but with significant resistance. Projected outcome, mutually destructive confrontation. The confrontation became philosophical debate about nature of service to emperor, rather than simple opposition between heresy and orthodoxy, her voice cutting through chamber with resonance that suggested she understood implications better than most, recognition rather than horror, flooding her features as understanding crystallized that her own mentor had theorized about such systems decades ago as ultimate expression of imperial doctrine. You argue that Siren represents perfection of imperial military philosophy, Moriana observed, her words carrying weight that made bone regiment shift without conscious command. Service beyond death, tactical coordination that exceeds anything living formations could achieve, victory at any cost measured in souls rather than territory. But the Imperium fights for man, not merely for victory, and the heretic wins when you forget the difference. Corporal Mirren served as translator between Network's collective consciousness and Inquisitor's individual perspective, her neural interface retaining enough humanity to bridge gap between living authority and accumulated military database, her voice layered with echoes of 13,000 souls, speaking in language that carried emotional resonance, capable of anchoring fragments of personal identity within collective purpose. Then tell us where the line lives when the enemy does not stop, Mirren whispered, her words steady because she chose to make them so while ice crystallized on her lashes. And through her connection, I felt Network lean toward Moriana, like congregations seeking absolution for sins they could not name but knew they carried. Philosophical assessment, Network thesis, preservation of imperial military doctrine through collective consciousness. Inquisitor antithesis, preservation of human individuality and free will. Resolution probability requires external arbitration through force. Moriana paced the chamber's perimeter where cogitators ticked like counting teeth, her boot heels ringing against grates that wept preservation fluid in thin runnels, while she recited understanding that cut deeper than condemnation. Magos Arcturos proposed memorial engine that would keep doctrine from dying with men, but he lacked courage to admit what such engines devour. And you have created something beautiful and terrible. Tactical miracles achieved through accumulated suffering that makes victory academic rather than triumphant. She set small adamant casket on dais lip, with delicacy reserved for placing relics upon altars, ozone prickling as hidden mechanisms stirred within black glass, threaded with warding sigils that crawled like frost. And when she spoke, the device's designation, her voice carried weight of final judgment. Hexamortis pattern soul scrambler, virus bomb for psalms that severs harmonic linkages and silences choirs. With this I can grant rest to everything you have collected while murdering every victory you are presently conducting. The bone regiment swayed as breeze that did not exist touched their tattered pennons, five-tone fragment going minor like wound, remembering knife, while environmental conditions fluctuated in patterns corresponding to emotional tension. Moisture beading on surfaces carved with names of faithful as temperature dropped with each exchange, frost feathering across chamber walls, while air grew thick enough to taste. Metallic and sweet, like reliquary preservation fluids, mixed with something that made teeth ache, in frequencies existing partially beyond dimensional boundaries, our reality typically accommodated. Device status. Hexamortis, safe configuration. Arming sequence requires triple right confirmation and biometric HIM. Effective radius, 8-13, 17 kilometers. Yield, total severance of psychic connections. Collateral damage, universal desynchronization of active Imperial formations. Understand the arithmetic, Moriana continued, her hand resting on device that pulsed with potential to destroy accumulated devotion, spanning 3 millennia. If I prime this, every node goes quiet. The dead fall, living lose their invisible general, cult tide returns with knives and prayers, but souls go where souls should go, rather than remaining trapped in service that promises neither peace nor dignity. The chamber became courtroom where fate of billions hung in, balance between human dignity and tactical necessity. debate unfolding through voices that carried weight of doctrine and desperation, while recurring motifs twisted into inversions that registered as both weapon and prayer. And through network connections, I felt every preserved consciousness holding breath they no longer possessed, while waiting for judgment that would determine whether accumulated sacrifice would continue serving Emperor's will or be released into rest that faithful service should have earned. The virus bomb counting in heartbeats, while Moriana's thumb hovered over first seal and spoke words that turned frost to smoke. Choose your leash, conductor, or choose your ending. Inquisitor Vex Moriana made her choice with deliberation that belonged in cathedral rather than battlefield, her hand moving away from the hexamortis device as understanding crystallized that Siren represented evolution rather than heresy. Tactical necessity, wrapped in methods that violated human dignity, while serving Emperor's will with ruthless efficiency that could not be abandoned in galaxy where survival demanded prices measured in souls rather than currency. She bled 3 drops onto the device's warding glass, not to arm, but to rewrite. Her rosette authority interfacing with Kairos's burned augmetics through sacred oils and error codes, while she spoke judgment that would reshape Imperial doctrine across the stars. You will not be unmade, but you will be yoked, serving the throne rather than replacing it, your expansion throttled to sanctioned theaters, while every soul remains monitored to ensure sacrifice retains meaning beyond mere tactical coordination. The compromise satisfied neither living nor dead, but preserved both tactical advantage and fragments of human dignity, her authority establishing oversight protocols that transformed Siren from weapon of unlimited expansion into controlled instrument of Imperial military doctrine. Recruitment hymn masked as memorial unless dual rosettes turned authorization keys, while amplitude bound to biometric governors that measured my pulse, hers, and Mirren's breath as living anchors to humanity within collective consciousness. Through neural pathways that pulsed with bioluminescent resignation, I felt network adapt to new parameters. 13,000 souls accepting yoke with obedience of soldiers who had died obeying and found no other way to stand. Their accumulated suffering balanced against tactical miracles they achieved when properly coordinated by living command authority that understood cost of victory measured in crystallized bone and preservation gel. Final status. Network nodes stabilized at 13,247,392 active connections. Expansion controlled through inquisitorial oversight. Imperial victory rate 94.3% across sanctioned theaters. Oversight protocols active with biometric governors and dual rosette authorization required for recruitment. The Bone Regiment took final formation around chamber. Perimeter, skeletal hands bringing weapons to present arms with precision that honored both duty and sacrifice, while their empty sockets reflected authority that transcended individual command. Eternal vigil ensuring Siren's power remained weapon rather than master, while preserving accumulated devotion, purchased with prices that made victory academic rather than triumphant. The flesh hymnal engine settled into steady rhythm that served as lullaby for dead rather than recruitment call, its preserved larynxes generating harmonics that carried memorial rather than tactical coordination, while processing accumulated devotion into acoustic monument to sacrifice that would never be forgotten, each throat producing tones that combined into frequencies our ears detected as prayer rather than weapon, though distinction remained academic when applied to service transcending mortality. Corporal Merrin remained beside throne as permanent liaison between network consciousness and living authority, her neural interface retaining enough humanity to translate collective purpose into language that preserved individual dignity while serving as anchor to concepts like choice and mercy within awareness, encompassing tactical knowledge spanning 3 millennia of faithful service. Her fingers, still warm and human, laced with mine along crystallized vertebrae, while frost bloomed across chamber walls in 5-point patterns that resembled benediction rather than weapon, moisture beading on surfaces, carved with names of faithful as temperature, stabilized into memorial rhythms, rather than recruitment signals. Air growing sweet with preservation chemicals that carried scents of sacred oils mixed with something that tasted like peace rather than torment. The recurring motifs found their final meaning through compromise that acknowledged both necessity and cost. Flesh remembers, becoming promise that sacrifice would never be forgotten while ensuring accumulated suffering retained purpose beyond mere tactical advantage. 5-tone fragment evolving into memorial hymn that honored dead while guiding living through battles requiring coordination, exceeding conventional doctrine, and numbers 8, 13, 17 marking coordinates where heroes chose duty over life, while serving as reminder that some prices were worth paying when measured against alternatives threatening everything Imperial civilization struggled to preserve. Tech adept Kairos documented transformation with augmetic systems, registering readings beyond comprehension, his consciousness fragmenting between individual awareness and collective database, while serving as chronicler for evolution, violating every principle of sanctified technology, yet achieving results serving Emperor's will with ruthless efficiency. Oversight protocol, sanctum coordinates marked with recurring digits, quarantine perimeters established, black box recording activated for soul integration monitoring, memorial registry maintained for all, network nodes. The catacombs of Cadia became shrine where living came to pay respects to those who served beyond death, visitors always departing with faint echo of hymnal in their minds, while some never left at all, their consciousness drawn into network through choice rather than compulsion, serving Emperor through means transcending limitations imposed by flesh, while maintaining enough personal identity to remember why they had chosen service over peace. Moriana established monitoring stations throughout network, serving as safeguards against corruption, while allowing accumulated military knowledge to continue coordinating Imperial forces across battlefields, where conventional doctrine proved insufficient against threats transcending mortal understanding. Her office built in transept of bone and light, where Rosette weighed every dispatch with gravity of planets. The network spread not through conquest, but through choice as dying. Imperial soldiers across galaxy heard hymnals call and chose eternal service over final rest. Their consciousness joining accumulated database processing individual suffering into collective strength, while maintaining fragments of humanity that made victory worth achieving rather than mere tactical exercise. Newborn soldiers took places in eternal regiment, as Imperial forces continued falling in battles, spanning the void, their souls finding purpose in death. They never achieved in life while serving through means honoring both duty and dignity, within constraints preventing unlimited expansion, and through psychic resonance carved by perimortem devotion, I experienced simultaneous sorrow and pride, as sacrifice continued beyond individual perception. In darkness of far future, where there was only war, the hymnal echoed through eternity, as promise that flesh remembered not just duty but dignity, and in choosing service over rest, the dead had found way to serve both Emperor and themselves, their vigil ensuring that those who fought need never truly die while preserving choice that made service meaningful rather than compulsory. Coordinates 8, 13, 17 marking where heroes stood eternal watch beneath Cadia's sacred soil, and sometimes in gale, between orders I heard hush that should follow good death, and perhaps that was mercy enough for soldiers who had learned to whisper rather than scream, their song never ending but bound by yoke that honored sacrifice, while preserving fragments of humanity that made the Imperium worth defending.